There's no doubt that Better Call Saul does more showing versus telling. Because we're never told explicitly what to think at any given moment, sometimes certain scenes or moments aren't clear in our minds until we dissect them a bit. So welcome to the fifth mini-essay in a casual series I'm calling Confusing Moments Explained, where we'll look at the most perplexing moments or elements in any story and explain what they most likely mean for the story and/or characters. These moments are often confusing because the relevance or meaning isn't apparent upon initial viewing, and that's okay because they're meant to be thought about rather than taken at a surface level understanding. So with that in mind, let's explore a heartbreaking but often puzzling scene from Season 3, Episode 10, Lantern, and answer the question, why does Chuck McGill tell his brother Jimmy McGill that he never mattered to him? Because we all know the opposite is true based on the arc of their sibling relationship throughout the first 3 seasons of the show. If it's your first time here, my name is Quentin. I'm a writer, a teacher, and sometimes performer. It's time to look at the compelling artistry of Better Call Saul yet again. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more videos like this one. Let's get into it. After 3 whole seasons of trying to prevent his brother from advancing too far in the legal profession, with this anxiety manifesting partially as a psychosomatic allergy to electricity, and then also burying complicated feelings of jealousy and insecurity in relation to his brother, why would Chuck tell Jimmy, straight to his face, that he never mattered that much to him? The sibling relationship and rivalry between Jimmy and Chuck is far more nuanced and complex than this particular video can explore. However, let's break down the basic, most likely reasons why Chuck went out of his way to hurt Jimmy so bluntly. These reasons fall under 2 overarching main impulses, one being that he wants to hurt Jimmy, and 2 being that he wants to push Jimmy away, like everyone else in his life. The first potential reason why Chuck says this to Jimmy is because he blames him for being forced to retire from HHM, which is perfectly understandable and grounded in some truth. In fact, way more truth than Chuck and Jimmy even realize. The chain of events that led to Chuck's rant at Jimmy's disbarment hearing was orchestrated on both sides, but you could make the argument that Jimmy's decisions from the aftermath of his suspension made things far more complicated for Chuck. Chuck actually started the process of facing his electromagnetic hypersensitivity rather than continuing to be vindictive to Jimmy. Maybe with the right therapist and approach, Chuck could have uncovered the deeper psychological reasons why he was experiencing this conversion disorder to begin with. But with Jimmy struggling financially and being told his own malpractice insurance rates are going to go up, he intentionally tells the insurance company about Chuck's public meltdown, like a final fuck you to Chuck for putting him in this situation, though Jimmy did actually swap those numbers in the first place. Now that HHM's insurance rates are going to go up due to Jimmy passing on the knowledge, that's the final strike for Howard Hamlin. He can no longer trust Chuck's judgment, and he has to force him out of the firm. He's become way too much of a liability, publicly and financially. So Chuck is bought out and forced to retire from the law. As Jimmy later says in the series finale, the law was the one thing he lived for. Neither Chuck nor Howard ever become aware that Jimmy put that knowledge forward, nor does Jimmy realize in this scene Chuck has been forced to retire because he passed that on. But even so, Chuck can still plausibly locate reasons to blame Jimmy for being forced to retire. It was Jimmy and Kim's battery trick that triggered his outburst, it was Jimmy who broke into his house and destroyed the tape, and it was Jimmy who committed forgery and falsifying evidence to get back at Chuck for taking Mesa Verde from Kim. From Chuck's perspective, he's been abiding by the law this entire time, while Jimmy has been up to his morally flexible antics. If it weren't for his antics, Chuck wouldn't have had to manipulate Jimmy by recording him and then setting him up to break in. That final battery trick from Jimmy sent him over the edge, and now look where he is, no longer a practicing lawyer. So he wants to hurt Jimmy by feigning indifference to him because he's angry at Jimmy for putting the dominoes in place that led to him being forced out of the firm he helped create. Chuck is trying to hurt Jimmy because he feels hurt by how Jimmy's actions have landed him without his passion. And Chuck's not about to take any personal responsibility for himself or consider how his attitude towards Jimmy may have provoked some of these antics. As far as he's concerned, it's entirely Jimmy's fault. The second potential reason why Chuck hurts Jimmy is because he's annoyed by his attempt to apologize, thinking it's disingenuous. I've often wondered if Chuck ever thought about making contact with Jimmy again, or if it came as a total surprise that he showed up at his door even after everything. I think Chuck probably planned on never seeing Jimmy again, or at least not to the same extent as before. Jimmy arrives looking to try and make some amends, especially after almost losing Kim in a car accident. But like Chuck, Jimmy is too emotionally stunted to get the right words out. He says he regrets how things went down between them, and he could have made different choices in retrospect, all of which he does mean. But really, Jimmy is trying to apologize to Chuck and see if they can move forward, but he can't fully own those apologetic words and feelings, so he dances around it a bit by substituting regret for an apology. I think Chuck can somewhat deduce this distinction, but tells him he shouldn't regret anything, because he's just going to keep hurting people. Essentially communicating, why are you going to apologize to me if you're not going to change? It's possible this isn't the first time Jimmy has tried to apologize but not followed through by altering his behavior, or maybe Chuck is just doubling down on his problematic belief that Jimmy nor anyone else can ever change. Chuck is certainly irritated by Jimmy's attempt to apologize for behavior that landed him into a forced retirement, especially because he believes it's disingenuous since Jimmy will never change. It's so haunting to me how Chuck bluntly and condescendingly tells Jimmy he would have more respect for him if he embraces his ability to be morally flexible, considering he always wanted Chuck's respect. Jimmy really took that to heart when you consider his future as Saul Goodman. From Chuck's perspective, his delinquent little brother has finally pulled the rug out from under him, and now he shows up to apologize? As if he could ever change. Never. Never. So Chuck goes out of his way to hurt Jimmy by telling him he never mattered that much to him. Why should Chuck make amends with Jimmy if he's simply not going to change, and if he's been proven correct by all the chicanery? He hurts him not only from anger but irritation at his attempt to apologize, in effect communicating that his regrets and apologies don't matter because he doesn't matter. The third potential reason why Chuck so black-heartedly hurts Jimmy is because he wants to isolate himself due to his ongoing mental health struggles. It's not only Jimmy's electric moral flexibility towards the law that triggers Chuck's symptoms, but it's also strongly implied his symptoms are triggered when any of his close relationships aren't going well. It's revealed in the episode Chicanery that Chuck's EHS began sometime after his wife Rebecca divorced him, and only got worse after Jimmy became a lawyer. But if his failed marriage was the catalyst for his EHS, then you could interpret Chuck's sudden sensitivity to electronic devices as a way to justify a self-imposed isolation. When we're stricken with mental health or life struggles, some of us choose to isolate and insulate ourselves from the world and other people for various reasons. I think for Chuck that reason was fear of dealing with his interpersonal issues, or fear of not possessing the people skills needed to deal with these interpersonal issues. And so maybe Chuck subconsciously used EHS as an excuse to no longer engage with others as much. After all, his problems aren't his control issues or relationships.
It's this goddamn electricity!
Rebecca tried to reach out to Chuck after the bar hearing, but he literally sat on the floor inside and ignored her pleas to come in, completely severing that relationship in his life, even as an ex-wife. Howard just forced him out of HHM and expressed how betrayed he felt professionally and personally by Chuck threatening to sue the firm, so that professional relationship and personal friendship is now gone as well. So as we can see from Jimmy's visit, Chuck is back to isolating himself in his house, no friendship with his ex-wife, and no job to occupy him or give him purpose. He may be doing better in terms of his EHS symptoms, but even with the electricity running through his home, it's still incredibly dark in there. Chuck seems to already be in the process of self-isolation, now that he's lost the most important romantic and professional relationships in his life, along with his career. He's definitely not in the mood to see Jimmy, but he lets him in anyways. And Jimmy's attempt to make some amends only triggers his wanting to isolate himself further. He doesn't want anyone trying to reconnect with him. From his perspective, everyone has already abandoned him. Chuck's self-isolation and inability to mend his deepest relationships becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more he mistreats people out of his own troubled psychology, the more they reject him, and thus he feels the need to isolate, which reinforces his troubled psychology. So if everyone has already abandoned him, he might as well shut the door on his sibling once and for all. To push Jimmy away and double down on this necessary isolation from others, Chuck tells him the cruelest thing, that Jimmy never mattered that much to him. And with that, he successfully pushes him out. Jimmy leaves without either one of them saying a word after that. Although there is a brief but significant moment where it looks like Chuck is remorseful from what he said, and this ties into our final reason. The final potential reason for Chuck's hurting Jimmy with his words has to do with psychological reaction formation. Chuck is trying to convince himself that his younger brother never meant anything to him, so as to avoid the reality that Jimmy had way too much significance in his life. Reaction formation is defined as, quote, a defense mechanism in which a person unconsciously replaces an unwanted or anxiety-provoking impulse with its opposite, often expressed in an exaggerated or showy way, end quote. In Chuck's case, the unwanted impulse, or rather feeling, is jealousy and insecurity towards Jimmy. Part of Chuck's disapproval of Jimmy isn't simply his attitude towards the law, but the fact that he believes Jimmy was more loved. As actor Michael McKean has even pointed out, Chuck made their mom proud, but Jimmy always made her laugh, even calling out for him just before dying, while Chuck was sitting right next to her. I think that was truly the moment when Chuck's feelings of insecurity and jealousy came full force. So when Jimmy became a lawyer like Chuck, that sent him even more over the edge, since the law was a domain that was always Chuck's, on top of viewing Jimmy as a slippery person who could never change. And he never found a way to appropriately deal with these feelings, except by isolating himself and blaming it on electricity. Chuck may insist that Jimmy never mattered to him, but it's a bold-faced lie. Jimmy mattered too much to him. So much so that he would go out of his way to bail Jimmy out of jail back in Cicero, and then allow him pre-prosecution diversion even after the 1216 antics, effectively keeping him out of jail twice. Chuck is petty, vindictive, insecure, and jealous of Jimmy, but he also cares about him in his limited ways. But Jimmy also triggers these difficult feelings of insecurity and jealousy within him, so much so that he'll avoid these feelings by acting in the opposite way. To avoid these true feelings within himself, he'll insist that Jimmy never mattered to him, effectively bypassing the feelings and pushing away Jimmy for good. But that brief moment where he covers his mouth and looks away as we hear the sound of the door closing demonstrates that he may have said it, but he didn't truly mean it. Although, the damage is done. Chuck has now closed the door on all of his most important relationships, and after this conversation, he relapses into his EHS, trying desperately to get Jimmy, Rebecca, Howard, insecurity, jealousy, and the need for control out of his mind, if he could just find the remaining power in his house. Even after completely ridding his house of any electrical power, he's still left with himself and all of his demons. And we all know what unfortunately happens next. So to conclude, those are all the reasons I believe why Chuck tells Jimmy he never mattered to him. He's angry at Jimmy for his role in forcing him out of HHM, he's annoyed at Jimmy's attempt to apologize, he wants to further isolate himself out of avoidance, and he's trying to convince himself Jimmy has never had any significant role in his life, when the opposite is very clearly true. This is such a heart-wrenching scene. What do you think about it? Let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. My Patreon is linked below if you want to support me in making these videos. Or hey, why not throw me a tip by clicking on the 3 dots below? Or become a member of the channel. You can earn some badges and get early access to videos like this one. Any amount you can afford helps a lot. Thank you. A special shout out to all of our channel members: Vermilion Star, Beatrice Paz, Coral Etkin, Adam S, and Niraj A. Thanks for the continued support. And don't forget, hit that like button and subscribe. See you soon.